George. The World Players Association has a vision. Thanks, Matt. The World Players Association has a vision of advancing the dignity of the player and the humanity of sport. And in order to do that, we're pursuing a three-part goal. The first is to ensure that the human rights of everyone who's involved in the delivery of sport are respected, protected and upheld. And the second is to ensure, of course, that that's true for the players. Thirdly, we need to make sure that sport has a positive impact on people in economic, social, cultural and humanitarian ways. And as we look at sport in recent years, then unfortunately it's true that in many parts of the world it's falling short. The World Players Association, in partnership with our friends and like-minded organisations in the Sport and Rights Alliance, has made great progress in pursuing this goal over the last 2 years. We've led negotiations with the International Olympic Committee to amend the host city contract to embed human rights requirements. We've done the same with UEFA, European football's governing body, in relation to the bidding and staging requirements of the European Football Championships and the Champions League. And more recently with FIFA, we've seen the adoption of a binding human rights policy which also applies to the players. These initiatives are transforming the legal governance of mega sporting events. But today is all about the players. The World Players Association brings together over 100 organised player associations who together represent some 85,000 professional athletes in more than 60 countries. Players are people first and they sit at the heart of sport. Today we are announcing the Universal Declaration for Player Rights, which articulates the existing obligations of sport organisations to respect, protect and uphold the fundamental human rights of players. The Declaration contains 17 provisions, 16 that set out the rights of players under international human rights standards, and one which is an overarching duty on the part of every player to uphold the human rights and the fundamental rights of their fellow players and, of course, everyone else who's involved in sport. The process in developing the Declaration has been extensive. It builds on the 50 years plus of experience of the unions that belong to the World Players Association in representing players. It takes into account surveys involving thousands of players conducted by our affiliated player associations. And of course, it takes into account the views of human rights experts, including Minky Worden of Human Rights Watch and Rachel Davis of SHIFT, one of the world's leading organisations in relation to the implementation of the document they've been binding on all sporting organisations, known as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This document is not just a piece of paper. It's going to have two profound impacts on the world of sport. The first is in terms of the content. It will change the content and the terms under which sport is regulated. And secondly, it will change the culture of sport. Sport must now be run in partnership with the players, and sport must act proactively to prevent and minimise and address any adverse human rights impacts on athletes. Thanks very much.
My name is Jamari Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the NFL Players Association. First and foremost, welcome to Washington. It's a pleasure not only to be joined by our friends, and I'm not telling anyone anything that they don't know, but when it comes to the player associations for hockey, basketball, baseball, and football, that we've continued to work together over the last several decades, and I'm proud to be joined by Michelle Roberts, Tony Clark, and Don Fear today. Today is about recognizing the rights of people who we cheer for, people that we look to as role models, and people who we enjoy because they bring something called sport into our lives. At the same time, however, it is to remind everyone that while we cheer for these people, the work that they are doing is, for the most part, a full-time job for each and every one of them. And today, on behalf of Brendan, our partnership with recognizing the rights of athletes worldwide, we're proud to host nearly 40 union members here in Washington, D.C., who not only have dedicated themselves, in the most part, to the sport that they have chosen to participate in, but to take upon themselves the larger and more moral of representing men and women in the future, where we hope that they will have rights that are far more respected and rights that are far more protected than the rights that workers who work in sport have now. So on behalf of everybody here who is taking the time out of their busy day to join us to represent nearly 85,000 athletes worldwide, we're thrilled to host, and we look forward to working with this Declaration of Rights for Workers. And we're thrilled to continue the role of growing unions throughout the world for not only workers and athletes today, but those who are going to come tomorrow. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Basketball Players Association. I won't reiterate what Schwabi and FD already said. I will say this. Apart from it just being the right thing to do to advance human rights for those people involved in sport, I'm going to confess to somewhat selfish and self-interested in acknowledging that while our players here in the States enjoy presumably the same constitutional protections that every citizen and resident of the United States enjoys, the reality is that for my Players Association, over 1/3 of my members are international players, and most of them return during the off-season back to their home countries to play. We've not been able or willing to ignore that whatever they enjoy here, they don't necessarily enjoy when they go home. So for selfish reasons, apart from it being just a moral imperative, for selfish reasons, we feel very strongly that the same privileges that our players in the States need to be enjoyed throughout the globe, and all athletes, all people involved in sports, are deserving the same rights and privileges. So I'm proud to be here with the other unions that are standing for these issues, and that we full-throatedly support the Declaration.
Good morning. This is Jonas Bear Hoffman speaking on behalf of FIFPro, the World Football Players Union. Of course, absolutely, the World of Football Players supports the work that the World Players Association is doing and the declaration we're announcing today with all our powers. And to add a bit to the words that were already spoken and adding a bit of global context, what makes our scope on this maybe a bit different is that we're an organization with member unions in 63 countries and representing roughly 60,000 professional players. Now, the challenges that every one of them are facing are very diverse. Those players play in the English Premier League, in the La Liga in Spain, but they also play in the Malaysian Super League, and they play in the Ghanaian Premier League. What we find is that in the end, the challenges that they face, when you translate them down, they're rooted in those very rights that we're talking about today, and the solution to addressing them is based on the rights that we're talking about today. We've studied over the last 2 years roughly 19,000 professional football players in men's and women's football. And the challenges that we find there, which relate to disrespect to the payment of wages, which more than 40% of our members are facing, the discrimination and violence that they have to accept in their workplace, the problems around equality between the male and the female players, but also international and domestic players, all of those are based on the human rights that they should be enjoying. Now, why don't they? Because they oftentimes have to work in an environment where the process of collective bargaining, the process of unionization is undermined, where the sport is not accountable to them, and where the access to remedy is not always granted. How are we going to bring this document to life is, I think, in the end, the most important question that we're going to have to be working on in the next years. And we're very thrilled that we've been recently able to sign an agreement with FIFA in which the recognition of the human rights of the players was a fundamental component. And based on this first-time translation of existing human rights obligations into the world of sports and into the rights of the players, we're very confident that we'll be able to find solutions based on this declaration, and that's why we feel this is a very important day and a very important announcement.
And now we'd like to open up to questions from members of the media. Would anyone on the phone like to ask a question?
I would. Do you have to press a number?
Nope, you're live. You're live right now.
Hello, all. This is Liz Mullen with Sports Business Journal. I'd like to know this Declaration of Rights, which unions in North America have signed it, and what is the potential practical impact on collective bargaining of signing this Declaration of Rights? What's in this Declaration of Rights that is not contained in your current collective bargaining agreement? And are there any rights that are in the Declaration, not in the CBA? How is it going to help players get those rights? Thank you.
Liz, this is D. Smith. How are you? Happy holidays.
Good morning. Happy holidays.
The importance of the Declaration is actually it's philosophically bigger than just the issue of collective bargaining. It's reminding everyone that where we start in this process is that the men and women who play sports did not choose to give up the basic human rights that we would want for every worker. So the way in which it helps collective bargaining is to ensure that our starting place for collective bargaining is that athletes are somehow not less protected than ordinary workers. And what this declaration, I think, does in a very powerful way is to remind everyone who is fortunate enough to work in the business of sports, including journalists, that the people that they are covering for a living are humans, that we demand a respect, a certain humanity that comes with who they are before they decided to do what they decided to do. So going forward, whether it is recognizing that gender inequality is unacceptable, recognizing that basic human rights, because you put on a uniform, can be ignored, that's unacceptable. So as we go forward, Liz, while you and I know that we spend a lot of time in the States talking about the issue of collective bargaining, there are literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of athletes across the world who wished that they could simply engage in collective bargaining. And the reason why they are unable to engage in collective bargaining is generally the leagues or the people that they work for start off with a proposition that they're not entitled to it. And they're not entitled to it because they're simply athletes who should be happy and thrilled with the ability to play the sport and otherwise keep their mouths shut. What this declaration stands for is that there are a group of men, women, and especially in Europe, in Africa, sometimes children, who are professional athletes who are not being afforded the same level of human rights that you would want for your son or for your daughter. And for this group of union leaders assembled in this room, including the people in North America, we think it's time to make a stand and make sure that we clearly express that we believe that they're humans first.
This is Marina Schweitzer from Germany. I have a question from National Public Radio in Germany, or actually two questions. The first question is, are there actually associations from Germany that have already signed the declaration? And the second question is, were there any recent happenings that made it more necessary for you to launch this declaration now?
Thank you for the question. It's Brendan Schwab speaking. There is a gap in the organisation of athletes around the world, and that is in Germany. It's one of the countries where athletes are trying to get organised. As you know, we saw recent moves to establish an athletes commission in Germany, which is some form of independence away from the National Olympic Committee. So clearly there are underlying issues that are there for athletes in Germany. But I would answer the question to say that the challenges that we're addressing are unfortunately long-standing. And the reason why we're announcing this declaration today is because the athletes have gotten organised in order to address those long-standing challenges. Jonas mentioned some of them, but I think we can summarise them in 4 key ways. There's problems with athletes accessing a safe sporting environment, an environment which is free of corruption and cheating. There's problems in athletes accessing sport without being discriminated against. Sport is incredibly reluctant, as Dee was just saying, to recognise the fundamental labour rights of athletes. And we are also seeing, and this is a particular issue in Europe, lack of respect for the personal rights of athletes in terms of data protection, their right to an education, their right to pursue life beyond sport, their right to a private life. These are all issues which are articulated in the Declaration, and our job is to ensure that where they're not upheld, where those rights are not respected, that sport has in place the framework to ensure that the athletes can access a remedy.
Thank you.
Does anyone in the room have a question? Yeah, go.
First up on the, you talked about a sporting environment free of regulations. Obviously, in light of what happened in Russia and the Olympics, has there been any discussion about any standards or anything to go to?
Of course, doping is an issue that is of concern to all of the athletes of the world. But we are alarmed that what we've seen in Russia highlights that there's been not just institutional doping, but state-mandated doping, almost subjecting athletes to scientific experimentation in the pursuit of sporting success. This has occurred under the eyes of an international governance system that imposed a very strict regulatory framework which we believe does not respect fundamental rights of athletes in terms of the presumption of innocence, in terms of the right to a fair trial, in terms of a just and proportionate penalty. So we have this inconsistency of corruption existing under this anti-doping system, yet the fundamental rights of the athletes not being respected. So we want to devise an anti-doping system that respects the fundamental rights, but more importantly is also effective. And one of the great things about the World Players Association is we are bringing together unions from all around the world, and these unions have actually solved this problem. These are unions that we've seen solve this problem. So the rest of the World Anti-Doping Agency, can learn from the World Players Association and our affiliates. But we don't believe that an effective doping system can exist in a way which is inconsistent with the fundamental rights of athletes.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is
I find it somewhat ironic that when it comes to issues of a clean sport, that there is almost an automatic leap to issues of doping and the potential of athlete cheating, and there's virtually little to no discussion about the corruption that has clearly infected sports bodies, sports leagues, and sports owners. When I read about upcoming FBI investigations in the NCAA, or I think yesterday's headline about the FBI investigating the awarding of sporting events under their ability to look at international corruption that affects the United States. Journalists spend a lot of time talking about things like WADA and doping. The one thing that seems to me to be far more systemic and far more pervasive is perhaps the corruption that infects leagues and sports governing bodies. We have our problems here in the United States, obviously, when it comes to issues of corruption, referring to the NCAA basketball investigation. But when it comes to whether it's the awarding of the World Cup or issues dealing with FIFA, it seems to me that it's somewhat ironic that there is much less focus or even international scholarship on the issue of how does an athlete ensure that he or she is participating in a clean sport above what happens on the pitch or the field. And so when I think that we adopt and when we talk about the basic rights of athletes, one of the things that we want to emphasize is every athlete in every sport, I think, is entitled to know that the work that they are doing is free of corruption. And that's something that we hope that a document like this gets more people talking about than who have talked about it in the past.
Was that Damaris speaking?
Just one quick follow-up point too. We deal with the issue of whistleblowers, back to the issue of Russia. And we specifically acknowledge the need for sport to protect whistleblowers. It was courageous athletes that brought the situation in Russia to its head. And I think that shows that, in the main, athletes want a clean sport because their work, their labour depends on it. And we don't want a situation whereby athletes have to feel under any pressure whatsoever to cheat in order to exercise their right to work. And that's why I think we've seen such incredible progress in relation to this issue, in particular in North America, where I think the World Anti-Doping Agency can learn, but where it seems fairly reluctant to do so.
So from Rolling Sport, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Well, firstly, I commend the work that you guys are doing. I think it's fantastic and much needed in the world of sport. So credit to you guys for announcing this today. It sounds like a very positive initiative and one that should be embraced. Jonas, you talked about how it sort of comes into light, and obviously how you guys have worked with FIFA, have worked with FIFA to World Cup Association to embed these fundamental rights within the FIFA statutes. Can you give us a sort of indication of what your strategic vision for this document is, and in particular how it may empower sports where they don't have unions at the moment, the individual Olympic sports, as an example? Thank you.
Good morning, Sean. Good to hear you. I'll take the first one, probably leave the second one to Brendan to answer about the other sports. Where we stand on this, FIFA adopted this commitment in their statutes as part of their reform process, which was a very important step. But what we saw as necessary is that we re-emphasize that in the process of FIFPro and our member unions dealing with FIFA and their member associations, that human rights commitment is absolutely understood to apply to the players. Because the discussion about human rights in sports has been going on for a while, but it was oftentimes not necessarily reflected upon the athletes. So what we're going to engage with FIFA on now, and this is going to be a very important process for us, is that we're going to jointly analyze where in the activities that FIFA undertakes that concern the players we may find potential human rights risks and adverse behaviors. And we're going to work with them to obviously remedy those. But that may affect the regulatory forces of FIFA, that may refer to the judicial processes that they're involved in, but it also refers to obviously the democratic process of rulemaking, which is, let's say, getting closer and closer to a system of collective bargaining in football as well, but it's still in many ways entrenched in the governance system of international sport that we all know. And those elements need to be properly separated so that all of our members in all of our countries have the ability to fairly negotiate their terms of employment, their circumstances under which they participate in their events, but of course also on the global level where we set a framework together with FIFA, which we have seen as being actually quite positive in moving in that direction, so that every athlete that is participating under this umbrella of world football has their basic rights and their basic conditions taken care of and not have to struggle for their recognition as they have to today in many countries. Brendan, the other question I'll leave to you.
About the strategic vision. Hey, Sean, it's good to hear from you. I know you've analysed a lot, for example, the role of arbitration in sport at the global level. And, players have fought a heroic struggle going back to the early 60s, starting with George Eastham. I mean, here in Washington, D.C., we know the great players in U.S. sports, Curt Flood and many others from all the sports, who fought for one of the most fundamental freedoms that's recognised in the Declaration, the freedom of movement, the freedom to choose your employer. This was, of course, won by Jean-Marc Bosman in the mid-90s. But subsequent to that, what occurred was with global arbitration and the Court of Arbitration for Sport, sport succeeded in developing a series of rules which overrode national law, and in overriding national law, trumped the power of national law. That's going to change, and with the Declaration, the international sporting organisations know their businesses. They therefore have an obligation to uphold the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. And so therefore we're going to see a shift from sport-specific based arbitration to arbitration which upholds the fundamental rights of athletes. FIFA's in the middle of that process right now, and our job is to make sure that that process extends throughout the rest of the world of sport.
Thank you.
We have one question in the room. Hi, this is Markenzie Johnson with ESPN's Undefeated. This is kind of specifically for professional basketball and professional football. One of the declarations covers mental health and social well-being of the athletes. How do you feel your respective leagues are handling issues surrounding mental health, maybe painkiller addiction? We see a lot in the NFL, and also the issues of pain relief. I think it kind of ties into that painkiller addiction as well.
So I'll begin by saying not well enough. And the good news is, at least at the NBPA and professional basketball level here in the state, we have recently reaffirmed our commitment to doing a better job. So we are now literally in the process of constructing what I refer to, what will be referred to as a mental wellness program. And so that's one, and stay tuned. I think there'll be more about that to come. With respect to pain medication, and this is kind of interesting, I'm sure you, like the rest of us, have listened with interest to former Commissioner David Stern's suggestion that the league consider the concept of medical marijuana as a permitted use, as something permissible to address pain issues. And so we're now studying commissioners for putting that issue back on the table. And so on the mental wellness piece, I think we're fine. We are catching up to the NFLPA and trying to address issues related to pain medication. We don't have, well, the thought is that we don't have the level of injury that is experienced by football players, and that may be true. Nonetheless, I think that we have done a poor job of addressing what are clear issues related to pain, and I'm talking now on the physical side, but certainly we've not done anything near what we need to be doing in the area of mental wellness. But the encouraging sign is that we are now.
Look, we have, over the last 9 years, been nothing less than aggressive when it comes to the health, safety, and welfare of our players. So, in no particular order, if you, and I invite you to go down to the 4th floor of our office today where the trust is housed, we have nearly 30 people dedicated in this building and probably another 100 or so people dedicated across the country dealing with the health, safety, welfare of our players with respect to transitioning out of a game where we know it's a 100% injury rate into a balance of their lives where we hope that it's more productive and more enjoying than their lives as athletes. But all of that starts with the fundamental starting point that we believe that it is important for this union to treat the people who engage in these works in this work as humans first and players second. So it's in that frame that we've recently sued the National Football League over the issue of our right to find out the aggregate amount of painkillers that have been dispensed to our players over a series of years. Now, you would expect that a commissioner and a league that professes to care about the health and safety of our players, and a league that likes to trumpet what they're doing with respect to concussions and traumatic brain injury, would be ready to turn over something as important as the aggregate amount of painkiller medication delivered to our players, because then both of us can make informed decisions about the work that the workers are doing that leads to the pain, that leads to the need for painkillers. But when a union has to sue its employers to get information that you think that they would be willing to readily distribute, you now know what the work of not only this union and Michelle's union and Tony's and for the folks in this room, you understand that there is always going to be a battle to force employers to recognize the humanity of the people who do the work first. So when it comes to mental health, our job is to make sure that that's where we start. We have a robust collective bargaining agreement when it comes to neurocognitive benefits. We have a robust policy when it comes to what should happen on a field if we think that a player has suffered a brain injury. Have we had to sue teams and the leagues and file grievances to make sure that that's enforced? Yes. But at the end of the day, while we strive for perfection, I think everybody in this room probably can tell more horror stories than I can ever tell, that our first and foremost job is to make sure that we are in a position to protect the interests of our players. And so, you know, whether it's the trust or whether it's our director of wellness or whether it's our partnership with Harvard or whether it's what we're doing on trying to discover remedies for CTE or the identification of CTE, all of that starts with our belief that these are actual individual humans, men and women, who are doing this work, and they're not discardable, fungible entities that people can just throw away one day and not think about.
Could I add a little point on that? Because I think it's actually, probably looking across the room here of our colleagues, one of the most important issues that all of us are dealing with, and where, frankly, the unions across the world are the leaders in addressing this issue. But I wanted to maybe add an understanding of, yes, this speaks about mental health as an issue in itself, but the circumstances under which an athlete has to perform and go to work every day, these are all factors that will challenge his or her ability to cope with life, to cope with the stressors, to cope with the violence that they maybe see, the pressure of extending your career summer by summer, year by year. And if you look at some of the findings and some of the work that the unions here in this room do, and you understand the circumstances under which these people work, it is obvious that they will at times be challenged as to their mental health and their outlook on life. And I think this is maybe within all of this, looking at these athletes as people, the most important piece. And it's important, I think, for governing bodies, for leagues, to recognize how much of an important role the unions are playing, because the trust is there, because the players are able to open up to that body that represents their interests. And for me, I would think across all the sports, if we start to establish an understanding how all of these factors of indecent employment contribute to this is a major, major issue for all of us.
Okay, and I believe we're going to start wrapping up this session. Are there any last questions on the phone? Okay, hearing that there are none, thank you everyone for calling in and for everyone for being here. If you need any additional information My email is matthew.painter@uniglobalunion.org. Thank you.